The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Corinne Bonnevité, and I'm the Marketing Manager of ILEX Group. Welcome to our ILEX webinar of Leadership in the Agile Environment. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. First of all, feel free to open and close your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen and submit your questions during the session. The questions will be answered at the end of this session. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be provided within 48 hours. We invite you also to visit our website, ilexgroup.com, where you can find in our download section some very useful insights. You can follow, like our social media to keep you updated on our upcoming events. In order for us to improve our webinars, we will also ask you to take a very quick survey at the end of this session. Now, I will hand it over our subject matter expert today, Andy West. Andy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Good afternoon, everybody. Before I leap in and start and talk about who I am and all those sorts of things, I should just say I'm a project management trainer with ILEX, and I have been for quite some time, and I'll cover some of the other things as well. What I have is 3 questions to ask, which one of my colleagues is going to put up as a poll on the screen in front of you and ask you just to kind of indicate yes or no about whether you're interested in these sorts of things. The purpose of these 3 questions is just to understand who you are and what you're interested in. It helps me talk about the right things as we go through the rest of the webinar. The 3 questions we have, the first one, are you PRINCE2 qualified and looking to add extra skills? Okay. So are you PRINCE2 qualified and looking to add extra skills? Second question was, are you interested in applying Agile methods in your organization? Are you interested in understanding Agile methods, in applying Agile methods in your organization? And the third question is, do you want to develop your leadership skills? Do you want to develop your leadership skills? Right, as the last poll is just being collected, just a piece about me. As the slide will indicate, I'm Andy West. I'm a project management trainer. I work for ILEX and have done since about 2000. I've been involved in projects for quite some time. I'm a PRINCE2 trainer. I'm a PRINCE2 Agile trainer. I also cover things like project support and change management, a wide range of those sorts of things. So, having looked at that, yes, you're mainly PRINCE2 qualified. Yes, you'd like to apply Agile methods, and yes, you want to develop your leadership skills. I better talk about things then. The purpose of this session is to have a look at Agile and the leadership within an Agile environment, particularly within projects. I'll explain more about that in a second. So what we'll have a look at is what we mean by Agile development and Agile project management. What does Agile project management assume about leadership and the requirements of leadership? What does it actually need to make it work? We'll have a look at different styles of leadership, particularly what I'm going to cover is situational leadership, and then have a look at how within situational leadership, which particular styles may be more useful for the project manager working in an Agile environment. So if you look at PRINCE2, and a lot of you said, yes, you are PRINCE2 qualified, PRINCE2 doesn't cover leadership at all. It kind of gives you a choice. When we come to look at PRINCE2 Agile, it does start talking about the sorts of leadership that we might require, and we're going to have a look at is what are those sorts of requirements and how might we do something about adding some leadership skill to us as project managers. The first thing to consider is, what do I mean by Agile project management? Agile project management or Agile development techniques were developed in business as usual, and developed in the software area for the rapid development of, rapid development and launch of software. So if I compare traditional projects with an Agile project, traditional project is often what's called a waterfall kind of affair, where each of the various technical steps of a project are done, requirements are kind of defined and fixed, and therefore we vary time and cost. It's all about delivering all of the requirements to the right level of quality, and time and costs are often sacrificed for that kind of thing. And if you notice on the diagram on the left-hand side, something goes into operational use at the end of the waterfall, which means in these sorts of projects, we only really start to achieve benefits at the end, when something goes live. Within the Agile environment, what we're looking for is an iterative and incremental approach to the development of products. So rather than trying to build everything in one go, what we try to do is build in units. And the idea is that we build in fixed time boxes. And we can vary scope and move it into time boxes if we can't do everything at that particular time. But the idea is we go through all of the steps of development, but for a small unit, and we get things operational use early, which means we start to develop benefits much earlier. So organizations like this, because we can now start to see things being used, being accepted by the organization, and we start to get some benefits. And as you can see, the idea is that we do this kind of rapid iterative process by doing these things again and again and putting things to use and adding to what we've got into use. Now, Agile was originally developed for the ongoing development of items once they were in operational use, so during business as usual. What we're particularly going to be looking at is the development of the use of Agile within the project environment, because with usual Agile is fairly developed and there are certain assumptions are made, and I'll have a look at some of those things in a second. What we're looking for is, if we're doing a change to an organization and we're using Agile development methods within that, what kind of leadership do we need? So, sorts of things that Agile talks about when we talk about Agile development. As the slide says, there are concerns over the terms management and manager. And if I refer to the PRINCE2 Agile manual, it actually says there is a significant body of opinion in the Agile community that suggests there is no longer a need for the project manager role. This view is quite significant, as arisen primarily for two reasons. One, there is a view that any work can be carried out and managed as if it were business as usual work by breaking the work down to a size and level of certainty that allows me to manage as routine work. And secondly, the term manager is regarded as having negative connotations to many in the Agile community, as it infers a lack of trust in the people who make up the team, the belief being that they do not need a manager as they manage themselves collectively through self-organization. So the important point there is that if you look at the Agile thought process, what they're saying is, if we break a piece of work down small enough, it doesn't need any higher level of management. Now, I'm going to agree to that to a certain extent. I think that self-managed teams at the development level are actually really important and very, very useful. But if we're going to deliver change, there is a need for a control function. Are all the elements of development being coordinated? Is there a need, or is there somebody in charge of all of these pieces of work to ensure consistency across those? Now, whether the project manager should be the technical expert and managing the day-to-day work of the people in the project, now that's a point for discussion, I think. So organizations and owners of project boards always need a single point of contact, somebody that they can refer to who will organize things on a day-to-day basis on their behalf. If we're looking at the Agile idea by having small teams doing things, by working on those small units, do we have a single point of contact for the senior management? And there may well be multiple work streams going on at the same time. So at that point, I think the Agile argument of we don't need managers may be suspect. We need that kind of control function. But do we need managers within the teams? Now, I think that's a debatable point. So these are the sorts of concerns that come out when we start to look at Agile. And what we've got to look at is how do we make it work for ourselves? One of the important concepts within Agile is the thought process of servant leadership. Servant leadership is seen within Agile as being a kind of best practice for leading an Agile team. And the thought about Agile leadership is to be, the best way to lead a team is to be its servant. Not to take charge, but to provide things that it needs, to remove barriers to what's going on, to enable the team to function in an appropriate way. Of course, to do that, the team needs someone who is essentially removing those sorts of barriers. And the idea of servant leadership is very much where the Scrum Master comes from. And I think to a degree, the project manager acts as kind of super Scrum Master above those. The project manager and the Scrum Master have different roles, and they're for different reasons. But I think the project manager can have a similar kind of thought process. Now, if we look at the slide, it says under servant leadership there are 3 focuses that we're concerned with: empowerment, collaboration, and facilitation. If I deal with empowerment first, empowerment is the ability to delegate work to people and give them authority and ownership of that particular piece of work. Now, this is critical in any project. In fact, it's critical in all organizations. If we delegate without authority, then the people doing the work have to come back and check with that manager every time there is some slight variation to the work that's being done. Now, in project terms, if we think about PRINCE2, we talk about the use of tolerances. A tolerance is a limit on authority. If we delegate without tolerances, without authority, then essentially as the manager, as the leader, we are micromanaging the work that's going on. To make empowerment work, we have to delegate appropriately. And if I give you an example about a failure of this, this might put my argument in focus. I used to work for a water company before I joined ILX, and we carried out an exercise on empowerment in the organization. The purpose of the exercise was to enable frontline staff who were dealing with queries to resolve those queries on the doorstep with the customers. And particularly historically, if this involved any financial compensation or recompense, then all of those financial decisions had traditionally always been referred to the managers. Therefore, managers were involved in every element of decision making the moment money was involved. And the purpose of empowerment was to reduce the necessity of managers being involved in all of these sorts of decisions. Now, the implementation of empowerment depended on how much the manager, the local manager, understood empowerment. The worst example I actually bumped into was the manager told his team, "You're now empowered to make extra decisions." And quite rightly, the team asked, "Great, what decisions can we make?" And the manager actually said, "Well, I'll tell you when you overstep the mark." And without providing that kind of limit on what you can do and what you can't do, the team had no idea what was allowed and what wasn't. And therefore, essentially, they carried on referring every financial decision to their manager because they didn't want to step over it and be told off, essentially. The successful implementation of empowerment happened where the manager explained what was going on and gave a limit to the team that they were talking about. One of the most successful teams, the manager turned to their team and said, "In terms of dealing with customer queries, you are now empowered to make decisions up to," and he gave them a value, which I can't remember off the top of my head now, but he gave them a certain value. If it's within that value, you're on the doorstep, you know what's required, make the decision, agree that with the customer, resolve the query. If it's going to go beyond that, then you need to talk to me first, either by mobile phone or talk to me face-to-face, and we will come up with a solution which you can offer to the customer and take it. Now, with this, there was a clear line of when does the person doing the work take the decision and when do they have to escalate it. And this is what good empowerment, good delegation is all about. What was interesting with the second group was about 6 months into the empowerment exercise, they returned to their manager and said, "Boss, we've noticed 80% of the time we come to you, we're going 10 to 15 pounds above the limit you gave us. If you gave us some more authority, then you wouldn't have to be involved in quite so many queries." And because now there's a level of trust between the person delegating and the people doing the work, the manager was quite happy to delegate more work to those people. And this is the power of empowerment. If we're trying to develop people, actually we can delegate work, but we give them smaller tolerances. It means we have greater control. If we trust them and if they have a great deal of skill, we can delegate a lot more work and give them a lot more tolerance. But we can flex these things depending on who we're delegating to. And in order to make an agile team work, they have to know what work they have to be looking for, what is the end result of that work, and what decisions they can take in terms of the scope of that particular work. Now, critically, in agile development, teams work in fixed time boxes. So fixed periods of time with fixed cost, essentially. And what they can vary is scope. If they're running late, they can take things out. If they're running early, they can put things in. Now, in order to make this, have a customer representative, a product owner, who can prioritize the work for them and with them and go, if you want to take things out, here's the less important things. If you want to add things in, here are the things that are bubbling under as being the next importance. But by having this tolerance, this authority, the team can make decisions and manage their work on a day-to-day basis. And clearly, the more skill they have, the more we trust them, the more we empower them, and the greater flexibility they get. This underpins lots of ways good delegation and underpins servant leadership. Now, collaboration. One of the key targets within Agile is to keep the team stable. The reason for that is every time we change a team, the teams go back through the development process. Now, one of the most commonly referred to team development processes, I'm sure you may have bumped into this before, is the Tupman model: forming, storming, norming, and performing. A new team is in forming. They're not particularly productive, they don't understand each other's skills, attributes, who's going to do what. In order to move towards an effective team, they have to move through the layers of storming, norming, and performing. And within Agile, if we can keep the team stable, then because we're not changing the team, we keep them in the performing mode. Therefore, they work much more effectively. So we get that sense of collaboration, of synergy, where the sum of the total is greater than the sum of the individual parts. It allows also the team to share information. Now, one of the things to consider about collaboration is about team effectiveness as well as the development cycle. So I'm going to refer to Glazer and Glazer. Actually, what I'm taking both the Tuckman and the Glazer and Glazer information from is the Effective Change Manager's Handbook, which is a very useful thing looking at change in organizations, and it covers a wide range of additional skills that project managers might be interested in. Glazer and Glazer identified 5 key elements in effective teams. Team mission, planning and goal setting. Do they know what they're there for? Do they know what they're actually got to achieve? And of course, clearly as a leader of the team, if we haven't set those kind of objectives, what's the output of this particular piece of work, then it's difficult for them to achieve those things. Team roles. Do people know where they sit, what they're there for, what they're responsible for, why they're in the team? Again, it helps people function. Now, in an Agile team, what we want is flexibility of roles. We want people to support each other, and that will come along in a second. Team operating processes. Now, they need to understand how they work. This is one of the key roles of the Scrum Master in Agile development, if we're looking at the use of sprints and Scrum, is how do we work together as a team? What are my roles? How do we work in good situations? What do we do if things are not going very well? This links into the last bullet point in the slide, which is working agreements. One of the common things you'll see if you have Agile development teams is if they have an information ready, a big kind of whiteboard or wall with information on. One of the things on there, the team rules. How do we behave in this team? What are the rules about how we interact? Last 2 things that we have in Glazer and Glazer then, team interpersonal relationships. If we want our teams to collaborate, to work successfully together, they have to have good interpersonal relationships. So it is about keeping the team stable, making sure that any difficulties are resolved. Now, as a leader, we often have a responsibility for doing these sorts of things. A Scrum Master, similarly, in some of the meetings, the events you'd have under sprints, may have to do this sort of work as well. But it's important that those things are resolved so the team can work effectively together. And of course, keeping this team stable allows these relationships to be maintained and work together much better. And the last one is inter-team relationships. Teams don't work in isolation, they're always working others. And an interesting thing about effective teams is an effective team will not only share information effectively internally, they'll share information effectively externally as well. And so therefore, if you're looking at teams from the outside, one of the good diagnostics is, are they sharing information with me if I'm not part of that team? If the answer is yes, they're probably sharing information internally effectively as well. If the answer is no, there is a good possibility that they're not sharing information effectively internally either. The last element on here, the focus of servant leadership, facilitation. And again, I'm taking a quote from the Effective Change Management Handbook. It says, facilitation is the act of planning and managing a group so that it achieves its objectives in a timely and effective manner. Scrum Masters have to facilitate lots of the events, the meetings that we have during sprints. Project managers have to bring the team together in terms of planning meetings, understanding how we're going to work as a team. Therefore, it's critical that we have these sorts of facilitation skills. So if we look at those, they talk about servant leadership, and this comes from the Agile point of view. But as project managers, these three terms actually become quite important to us as well. Because if we want a team that's going to be effective, we want empowerment so they know what they're doing, collaboration so they work effectively together, and facilitation skills so that both you as the leader and perhaps them, if they're working in smaller groups, can facilitate meetings, events to ensure they have effective outcomes. Now, as it says on here, how much of this can be used depends on the context. It does depend on how you work, the relationships you have, and where people work. One of the limits on this sometimes is if you have a multi-site environment, sometimes a lot of these things work better face-to-face. So perhaps we need somebody on site if we have a multi-site arrangement who can provide this kind of servant leadership to the teams, which may be a role for team managers and that sort of event. If you look at PRINCE2 as a project management methodology, PRINCE2 in itself does not talk about any sorts of leadership at all. It just says you need to add appropriate leadership skills to the model to make it work. So therefore, when we look at PRINCE2 and PRINCE2 Agile, we can add all of these sorts of things and kind of go, well, yes, there is a place for it. Now, one of the things I believe is that a lot of the people who are working in Agile or are writing about Agile assume is that if we're working in a normal project, then we are working in a command and control kind of environment. I don't believe that's always the case. In fact, leadership is always considered to be a kind of continuum. Sometimes command and control may be an appropriate mechanism, and other times it's not. Therefore, one of the things I'd like to introduce this afternoon looking at this is situational leadership. Situational leadership is a model developed by Hershey and Blanchard. The book is called the 1 Minute Manager. And what it looked at was, in different circumstances, there are different sorts of leadership style. And they identified 4 as a primary one, and there will be variations of this. So if I look at this, there are 2 dimensions we consider. It talks about task behavior, which is about telling people how to do the work. And the further we move to the right, the more we focus on telling people how to do the task. The more we move to the left, the lower end of the scale, the less we need to, because they have the knowledge and skills to do the task themselves. The relationship behavior. How much support, how much involvement do I have? If we're moving up that one, then there's an increase in the interactions between the person leading and the people actually doing the work. So there's much more emphasis on the relationship between the 2. As we move lower on, it's less about the relationship, it may be more about getting the work done, building that relationship between them. And so there were 4 leadership styles identified. S1, high task, low relationship. I focus on the work, I'm not the person. I'm not really looking at developing them necessarily or providing support. I'm just going to give them simple tasks. Now, in the slide later on, this is actually called telling. I first learned this a long time ago when I was being developed or trained to be a manager as directing. It is the same kind of thing. It is kind of the command and control. I want you to do X, I want you to do it this way, and off you go and do it. Moving up to S2, it talks about high task, high relationship. With this kind of leadership, we're looking at both a great deal of detail about what they're going to do and a lot of support for the individual about how they do it, why they do it, the reasons behind it. So high task, high relationship. Current term for that is called selling. I have to say, when I first learned it, it was actually called coaching, but just shows how old I am, I suspect. The important thing here about this is that this will take quite a lot of time and effort, because we're actually going to look at both two things. One, what the task is and how to do it, and two, removing barriers, providing resource, providing support. And therefore, I always think the kind of coaching title to this works quite nicely to give us that kind of thought process. The low task, high relationship. The people doing the work here don't need to. There's not a great deal of focus on what the task is. There's almost an assumption they know how to do these sorts of things. What they have is some kind of letter commitment to do so. So this is much more about supporting them through the work. It's currently called participating as a leadership style. Again, I learned it as supporting a long time ago. But the thing here, and that's the key to this, is what do you need from me so that you can? The focus is on removing the barriers, enabling people to do the work by removing things that are getting in the way. The last of these is low task and low relationship, and that's simply called delegating. With these, as the leader, you don't need to give them very much information about how to do the work, and B, you don't need to give them a great deal of support. They will find a way of doing it because they think about, they don't know how to do it. There's a great deal of skill here. Now, each of us have preferences for these different leadership styles. And interestingly, on the internet, you can, in fact, if you have a look for situational leadership, you can indeed find questionnaires that will ask you certain kind of questions and determine which of these do you have a preference on. Now, this is actually quite important for us as managers, because in order to do situational leadership appropriately, we should be looking at where are the people we're trying to lead, and therefore what is an appropriate style. And if we're using an inappropriate style, we can actually find, therefore, that we are not leading them in the most appropriate way. So let's look at the people. Where are my people? So we're talking about our maturity levels, and they've taken these as kind of points and say, no, this is a good way of thinking about these. Now, there can be some variations. I was looking at this leadership one earlier on today with another group, and they asked about if you've got high commitment but low competence. Well, that would still be in lots of ways a much easier M1 because they want to do the work. It may be move you into M2 quite quickly because they want to do it, they don't know how to, and therefore you need to still focus on the task elements of that kind of role. But if we look at this, low competence and low commitment, M1. One, that individual doesn't know how to do the work, and B, they aren't particularly interested in doing the work. They have a low commitment to doing it. Now, this may be that somebody brand new, it may be somebody who's picking up a brand new skill and doesn't particularly want to move into that particular area. It's somebody's been given a task that they think is not particularly interesting, exciting, and something that they don't really want to get involved in. And with those, a more directive style of leadership may be appropriate. We move on to M2. We still have that kind of low commitment. I'm not particularly interested. But with the fact there is some competence, what we can now start talking about is how is the job done? Why is the job done? How should we do these things in an appropriate way? How do you problem solve whilst you're doing it? And the point about this is to try and develop more competence and an interest in doing so. So we're looking at high task and high relationship stuff to build that kind of work. With M3, the high competence and variable commitment, the people we're talking to, the people trying to lead, know how to do this. But variable commitment, they may be looking for excuses or reasons why they can't do it, barriers to completion, barriers to doing the work. And as I said earlier on, the key thing here is what do you need from me so that you can? And as the project manager, as the leader, you're not trying to tell them how to do work. There's an assumption they can. What we're trying to make sure is that they have no reason to not do the work. And finally, the high competence, high commitment. What we have here is the high skilled people who know how to and want to, they're interested and self-motivated, and therefore I can delegate the work to them and they can get on and do this. Now with all of these, I will still need to delegate some authority for doing the work. If I have low competence, I may give them much less authority to do the work because I want to keep a closer control on what's going on. With a high competence, high commitment, I will give them much broader tolerances because I want to remain less involved. I can trust these people to do the work. If we combine the maturity levels with the 4 styles of leadership, then we come across this summary diagram, the situational leadership diagram. If we look along the bottom, we have the maturity levels running from right to left, and then we have the 4 styles of leadership going through. So low task, low relationship, I'm basically telling the people how to do this because they don't know how to and they don't want to. High task, I'm selling, participating, delegating. So there's a clear link between these 2 things. Now, when the situational leadership model was developed, what they were talking about was an individual, varying your thought process to deal with somebody as an individual. So they may be highly motivated and highly skilled in a particular task, but if you're giving them something they don't particularly want to do, then you might need to move to telling to delegate the work because they're not in their comfort zone. They're in low commitment and low competence because it's a new or different task. When we come to Agile, what we're talking about is delegating to groups, self-managed groups. This works within Agile because these teams are designed to do all the tasks of the development process as a self-managed team. So what we're looking for here is perhaps the high end. There is an assumption that these teams are collaborative. They are self-motivated. They know how to. What they need to know is what have they got to do. Now within the teams we would have a product owner who would help with some decision making in terms of what to move in, what to move out, reprioritizing the work as we go. As the project manager and perhaps linked in with a Scrum Master, what we need to make sure is that we're delegating appropriate work to that group of people. And I would suggest that if we're looking at situational leadership in an Agile environment, that the 2 leadership styles that will be most suited to this and link into servant leadership would be delegating and participating. This will particularly work, and it was a question that was raised at a similar one of these webinars. Well, what happens if we have new people in the team? If we're looking at a team of people, what we're looking for is that the team would be considered to be high competence and high to variable, depending on how they're feeling that particular day, that particular week, or when we try to agree work with them. And it's down to the team in sense of within their own collaboration sense in terms of their own development to look after the individuals within that. So the assumption, if we're looking at leadership within the Agile environment, is that we have high-skilled, high-committed teams, and therefore we focus on this higher end of leadership, delegating, participating. So if I'm just to pop up the next slide, the idea of and let's say I first learned this as supporting, so if you prefer different styles, it's supporting the workflow. It's removing the barriers to work. So this fits very well with the idea of servant leadership, of what do you need from me so that you can. It would be about assisting the defining of the work. What's going to be done? You know, what are the priorities? It's ensuring that that work is understood by all parties within the work environment. And any issues, queries that have been raised as part of planning that particular sprint have been identified, and the project manager can now pick those sorts of things up and deal with those. In terms of delegating, less work in removing the barriers, less need to motivate the team because they are indeed self-motivated. If we read a lot of the Agile kind of work, appear to be the more expected level for a project manager working with an Agile team, that you should be able to pass the work to them, help define the outcome to ensure they have clear objectives, and perhaps agreeing a monitoring process that you understand what's going on, and at the end accepting the work back. But all of those works about dealing with the problems and those come under the remit of the team because they have the skill attributes and the abilities to do those sorts of things. Having put this together, I was reading some things earlier on this week and was reflecting on the work of John Cotter. And Cotter, when he was talking about leadership, actually said the difference between management and leadership. Management is about controlling complexity, about getting all these sorts of things done at the same time. And leadership is about the control of change. So if we think about this in an agile environment as a project manager, you're there to control the change, and that's your role, is to lead those sorts of things. But your manage agile teams should be managing the complexity of the work. And if we think about that as a kind of separating those two things, that allows us to think about what we're trying to achieve, is that they will do the work, but you're leading that change to ensure it's the right change in the right way that the organization requires. And that kind of brings us back to, the starting point. If we want appropriate leadership in an agile environment, we have to understand what the expectations of our agile teams are, and in lots of ways, situational leadership. Are we adapting our leadership style to support the needs of our teams, the needs of our people? So there's our thought process. Those are the sorts of slides that I've brought up with. So now I'm going to ask, does that raise any questions? Do you have any queries you'd like to ask about any of the elements I've talked about? And I'm kind of expecting the chat panel to go mad now with lots of questions. Or rather, I'm hoping. What do I envisage being the biggest challenges of adopting Agile in a traditional organization? Actually, that's a very common question. One of the things to understand here is, does all the organization, do all the layers of the organization actually understand what Agile is and how it actually works? One of the assumptions, one of the things to believe in Agile is that the customer is not going to get everything they ask for. So one of the considerations here is, does your senior management, does the organization understand that when they give out some requirements, that what you're going to deliver is the things you can deliver within a time scale. It's going to deliver on time to budget, but there won't be everything they've asked for. Some things will be dropped out. If we don't have that kind of understanding, then I think we're going to get questions of, but I want everything. So there always needs to be some flexibility. So I think the important thing, or the trick here, is there an understanding of Agile? Is there a buy-in to Agile at all layers of the organization, not just at the development layer? So that does say, have we briefed our senior management? Is there understanding and a commitment to this? If I just go back and find a couple of other ones, there's the biggest challenge one. The Glazer and Glazer reference. Glazer and Glazer are a couple of people who worked on team effectiveness. Now, I actually took the quote from a book called The Effective Change Manager's Handbook, which is published by Kogan Page and is a support book for the change management qualification, details of which are available on our website. They actually have their own book, and I'm just going to try and find it. Glazer and Glazer, 1992 is when they published particular work, but I don't have the detail of the book in there. I'm just going to check in the glossary for those sorts of things. And I can't find it for the moment. If you raise a query afterwards, I'll try and find the detail. But if you have a look at the Effective Change Manager's Handbook, which was published in 2014 by Kogan Page with the APM group, then that has the references to Glazer and Glazer for you in there. There is a section on team development. So another question, is it not a good thing to allow people to move between teams to encourage new ideas and constructive challenge rather than keeping things the same when people become stale? This is actually a really interesting kind of conflict, because yes, moving people between teams does allow for the exchange of ideas. It does allow for people developing new skills and new things. Within the Agile environment, what they talk about is particularly within the lifetime and within the lifetime of a project. If we're using people in a development team to keep the team stable during that project, will give you value and benefit to the development process. I would then suggest that then changing teams between projects allow you to then get the benefit of new ideas and new things. Of course, you have to remember that at the start of a project, you will be going back through the development panels and therefore some forming and storming in terms of the development because you've got new teams to build. So there is a kind of conflict between those two sort of things, and how we resolve it is what works best for our organization. So I think perhaps keeping teams stable during a project, same development teams, is a good thing, but changing people between projects allows you to look for that kind of developing skills, working with other people, enabling exchange of ideas. There is perhaps another constraint on that idea as well, which is if you have a culture of knowledge is power, it doesn't matter what teams people are working in, they won't share ideas or knowledge because knowledge is power. If people see that sharing knowledge is the best way forward for developing A, themselves, and B, other people, then actually we get that kind of constructive challenge and constructive development, which is kind of what we're looking for. Agile kind of assumes the willingness and ability to exchange ideas and information as we go through. So let me just go down that. Challenges to adopting Agile, I've looked at already. What happens if there are multiple tasks within a project whilst carrying out usual day-to-day tasks? Now, again, this is a huge challenge within Agile teams, is their assumption that the team has been seconded to that particular work, and therefore their usual day-to-day tasks have been moved elsewhere, that there is a commitment to that particular one. Therefore, if the matrix management, which is what you're kind of referring to here, where you're part working on a project and part working on business as usual, it almost is, is there stability within what I'm working on and how much time? Do we have almost a formal working arrangement of how much time do I spend on those? There is a natural conflict between these two sorts of things. The Agile assumption is that you are doing one, not the other. That does start to limit the ability of Agile and stable Agile teams, because if you have both tasks, then clearly you're not working in the project at all times. So it is a natural conflict to that Agile environment, and there is no single right solution, I think. Again, clear agreements. What time do I spend on the project? What time do I spend doing business as usual? And then is it clear that whilst I'm working on the project, who am I working with to at least try and build a stable team working relationship within that project team as I do the work? Those two things would be the starting point for doing that. And I think one of the clear pointers here, is there an agreement with your manager or the people you're borrowing the resource from of timings and how those things are being carried out? Again, that comes under the working arrangements kind of idea of have we agreed those sorts of things. I've not done PRINCE2, but on lots of project management and led teams through change. How does Agile help me? Agile. Well, one of the things to consider is that PRINCE2 Agile is an add-on to PRINCE2. So if you've not done PRINCE2, then I would suggest you have a look at Agile Project Management, which is a similar kind of tool. It looks at combining project management activities with Agile. So the question really is, what does Agile bring? If you're getting complaints or queries, concerns in organizations about projects being late and over budget, the ideal of Agile is to fix the time and cost and to focus on delivering the right level of quality, but with the assumption the customer doesn't get everything. So if there is a need within your organization to focus on delivering on time to budget, then Agile starts to help focus on those sorts of things. And so therefore Agile methodologies are about varying other things as we go through. So I would suggest that PRINCE2 Agile if you haven't done Prince2 already, is perhaps not the route, but certainly have a look at our website, ilxgroup.com, and have a look at Agile Project Management, which has a similar kind of thing. It looks at how do I bring in those fixed time boxes and the use of scope tolerance to manage work as a way of protecting time and cost, and if you like, enabling my organisation to get things into operation quicker so that we can develop or generate benefits quicker as we go through. That would be the sort of thing I would suggest you have a look at. I've got that one. Agile will only work with competent and committed people. I don't know if any organisations like this. Agile, if you look at the fact that they want stable teams, the teams to be self-managed, to be a self-organized, self-managed team, there is a requirement for a level of competency and committedness, if that's a real word, commitment to the task in hand. Now, clearly, I agree with you. Not every person in an organization is fully competent. Every person is fully committed. Within Agile development teams, what we do need is a level of competence and commitment to that particular task, that they as a group wish to do so, and that they understand how they're going to work together to achieve those sorts of things. We would not get everybody in an organisation who is always completely competent, completely committed. I absolutely agree. And that is one of the challenges, and which is why if we have people or teams who do not have that commitment, it is very difficult, I would suggest, to use Agile in that environment, because there is a need for the project manager to be much more involved in the task. Or, if we're going to use Scrum Masters, they'll be involved on a much greater basis than perhaps they should be. Scrum Masters are seen as much more facilitators of the work rather than directly managing it. If we're moving to, if you like, the right-hand side of my situational leadership one, where there is a need when we're delegating work to talk about how the work is done, that suggests that the team as a group doesn't have a level of knowledge on how the task is done, which would undermine the idea of Agile. Okay, I'm not sure that it would stop it completely, because we want the teams to be considered to be competent enough. Now, it may well be that there is as a team, there are people within that team who have lesser competence or are lesser committed, but it would be to the team to manage those events rather than for the project manager to manage it directly. So that would be my thought process in this, is that the project manager essentially is dealing with a community that you have to see as being competent and committed, and within that team, they would deal with the less competent and less committed people because the team are self-managing. That would be how Agile would see this. It doesn't prevent using Agile, but the Agile team has a much more committed role to actually managing themselves. Recent examples of successful Agile project management in the public sector. What sort of project does it work best on? Interestingly, Agile project management has started from the IT area. It's been moving out into non-IT areas. Interestingly, at the moment, there is a project within the Ministry of Justice, a refurbishment project looking at facilities, which is being worked in an Agile manner to look at the refurbishment of courts and justice buildings. And that's using the Agile approach to try and do so. So it works best on those projects where there is some flexibility about how big the project is being delivered, about what is being delivered. Agile projects still focus on quality. Are we delivering things that are fit for purpose? It's just that if we start to run out of time and money, then what we start to do is we do less things by removing things of lower importance. So the importance of what sort of project we work best on, ones where we can clearly start to rank the user's requirements in terms of priority and what's a nice to have. It gives them some flexibility. If we're going to fix time and cost, we need some flexibility elsewhere. So it's all those ones where you can start to, where the users, the customer, if you like, can say, what must I have, what should I have, what's on the wish list, what would I give up quite happily. Are there any lessons known, challenges around how Agile affects or supports the live support activities when used in a DevOps approach? Now, DevOps, if I remember correctly, is one of the Agile methodologies specifically for software development. And I can quite openly say I am not an expert in DevOps. I've heard of it as a reference as a software tool. So one of the things here clearly is, do the team understand the DevOps approach that is being used? Do they understand how it's working? Is there buy-in to that approach from the organization to actually make sure it's going to go forward? So particularly if you're using it in the business as usual, developing things that are in there for add-on. In terms of the support activities, part of the development would have to be to the ongoing buy-in of the support and maintenance ones. Whenever you look at what's called in Agile terms a potentially shippable product, it should work for all users. That's not just the primary users, that would include people like the support team, because it's only a usable product if it can go into an operational and a maintenance environment, I would suggest. So there needs to be understanding in both the support people and in the user community that things will be delivered in an iterative way, that there will be kind of incremental, we'll get a part of it and there'll be more added later on. And if we have that, then it's those sorts of that starts to remove some of the challenges. The big challenges is if support are looking for, I want to take it in one lump, but you want to try and deliver it in incremental ways. So it is about understanding that kind of constraints as you go through. The headline sections covered in the PRINCE2 Agile course. In the PRINCE2 Agile course itself, what it would look at is things like what is Agile, why do we want to blend PRINCE2 and Agile, what are the benefits to do so. It looks at the focus areas of PRINCE2 Agile, which are the key things that it looks at about how you do it. It looks at how does PRINCE2 affect the use of the themes and the processes from PRINCE2, what effect does it have. So it tries to look at tailoring PRINCE2 into Agile environment. So if you are a PRINCE2 practitioner and you've used PRINCE2 in the past, then what you look at is what do I need to add, or what do we need to understand from the Agile environment to affect all of those sorts of things about PRINCE2. So we'll pick up things like the principles and the themes and the processes and cover those in how do I adopt those sorts of things. The best way of having a look at this, I suggest if you have a look at our website and look up the PRINCE2 Agile course, it should give details of what the syllabus is and how it actually covers those. So there's lots of information on our website about that. That is the last of the questions currently. Are there any more questions that people wish to ask? Whilst that's happening, Corinne, if I can hand over to you just to do the last couple of slides, and we'll see if any more questions come through whilst you're doing those. So, Corinne?
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. So if we go to the next slide, so this is the PRINCE2 if you're interested to take one of our classroom courses. This is the PRINCE2 Agile classroom courses that we have available in the UK. So we have classroom courses available in Nantwich, in London, in Bristol, and this is the classroom courses for the first half of 2016. And we will have more classroom courses coming for the second half shortly. If we move to the next slide, we have a great offer which is available until tomorrow, Friday the 15th of January. So you can save £200 if you take our classroom course using the code P2 Agile webinar. So instead of 950 quid, instead of 1,150. So you can book your course directly on our website, ilxgroup.com, or by calling us on the number that you have on the screen right now. So thank you very much for attending this webinar, and over to you.
There's a couple of questions. I'll just try and pick up, Corinne, before we finish. and if I just skip back a couple of pages before we shut down. On the first slide, you show the difference between the linear and an iterative project. This graph implies that 4 times the amount of work is required in an agile project than linear. Actually, on the diagram, what it's just showing is that essentially in a linear project, we do each of those tasks just once. What we're saying is in a iterative incremental project, we do all of those things. It's not showing it's 4 times as much work. So we don't do the whole requirements. We do some of the requirements in detail. We do design build. And essentially, the idea is that we can iterate. We'll deliver a part of it. One of the best examples of this perhaps is a website, because that's one of the common uses of this. Is that perhaps what you do is you get the landing page up, so you can start to do some advertising, collect some of the data, and then you add more information about product availability, or being able to order a product, or being able to check on progress and things. So the idea is each of the iterations is doing the whole of the development process, but it's doing a small part of it by adding information or adding functionality as it goes. So the idea is it's not you do this, it's the same amount of work 4 times, it's you're doing a smaller piece of work from beginning to end, and launching something which is a shippable product, something that can actually be used. So it shouldn't be the case of it's 4 times as much work. Is what you're doing is you're doing the same kind of development steps, but doing it on smaller pieces, but getting things that work you can launch. So it shouldn't be 4 times as much work. Key difference between a project sponsor and a product owner. A product owner is somebody embedded within a development team to make decisions on priority about that particular piece of work. So a project sponsor is somebody who owns an entire change, and they're often picked because they have the ability to make key decisions about the full scope of the change. So particularly if you work in a more hierarchical organization, you'd find the project sponsor is towards the top of the tree, and a product owner might be much nearer the working level of this is what we actually need in order to build a particular item. So it can be a degree of scale. Now on a much flatter organization, you may say that there is a close relationship between the 2 roles, but they're there for different functions. A product sponsor is to own a change in a project. A product owner is to help a team define what should be delivered and to kind of redefine the priorities of what should be delivered first. And the third one that came through at the end, working arrangements and behaviours within the team, please. Does this mean your top teams interacting with the external teams? The idea of working arrangements and working agreements is that when you come up with a team, it's clearly stating what do we say is an acceptable way of working. Teams naturally develop cultures of their own. What we're trying to do with working arrangements and working agreements is almost steer those of this is how we want the teams to behave. And it is a way of trying to ensure that we have clear working relationships, good interactions. And if you look at agile teams that have those, what we call the information radius, big whiteboards of information, there's often this is how we behave around here, that we are always honest with each other, that we always turn up on time to meetings. It's all right, the rules of engagement. Now, top tips for interacting with external teams. If you're going to deal with external teams, then one of the things would be it's almost the same kind of arrangement. If as a project manager you're trying to deal with teams, do they have those sorts of rules in place? And can we therefore start to agree a way of working with those other teams that reflects both of our natural cultures? It's almost the way of ensuring that there's an openness in the relationship, I think is the right way of answering that. And my top tip there is if we're explicit, we can talk about these things, we can actually agree them. If we don't talk about them, if we don't kind of resolve some of the issues, then they just sit there in the background. If I go back to Tuckman, storming is when we have disagreements and challenges about teams. It's resolving those challenges by openness. Good facilitation, perhaps in terms of meetings, is a way of resolving those sorts of things. So that might be my top tips for dealing with those, just briefly. Any useful templates and material on communicating multiple agile teams and overall program direction. In terms of templates and materials, lots of ways PRINCE2 Agile and Agile Project Management are looking at that kind of, the interactions between the teams doing the work and selling that to more senior people. So lots of things they talk about almost the relationship of, what's the project manager do and what's their role in capturing what's going on in the project and and communicating that on. What PRINCE2 suggests is, how do we tailor things like checkpoint and highlight reports? Checkpoints may become, you go and have a look at the information made, or you take an extract from that. Highlight reports would still be about collecting information and reporting on to senior management. But again, it's about what works in our organisation. One of the things you might consider with things like dashboards and balance scorecards, the use of reg reports. Again, that's how to make it work in our environment rather than necessarily templates. PRINCE2 gives you lots of documents. It's making those work. Remember, PRINCE2 gives you templates of documents. Within Agile, those may be conversations rather than formal documents. They still have the same purpose. It's just in a more informal way. So lots of the PRINCE2 things you might start as a kind of starting point. It's tailoring to make it work in a multi-agile tailored environment. It's how do I collect that information? And we can finally do this. Yeah. So if there are any other queries, please email us, and we will try and deal with any sorts of the queries. Are there any final queries that we need to deal with before we actually finish? Time is now elapsed. I think, Corinne, we're probably at the end now.
Yes, we are. Thank you very much, Andy. I wasn't muted. Thank you very much all for your attention today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much indeed.